Hello and welcome to Creating Under Quarantine. I'm Anina Collier with the Center for Creativity in Tulsa, Oklahoma, USA. And I am so excited to be talking to Anne Yoncha. Anne, welcome.
Thank you.
So Anne is one of the artists that is participating in our exhibition Quarantine. Anne, tell us a little bit more about you, where you're from, and how long you have been isolating.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, but I was most recently living in Montana for the past 3 years, doing my MFA there, and then doing a Fulbright fellowship in Oulu, Finland, about 3 hours south of the Arctic Circle. And that came to an unexpected end in the middle of March. So we were basically told to go home. And so I've been isolating here with my family in Delaware since then.
Well, I am so sorry to hear about your Fulbright and your project cutting short. Is there a chance you may get to resume that, or was it just a premature ending and there's nothing that can be done?
Well, I definitely hope to go back to Finland someday, especially because I didn't get to experience the midnight sun. But it'll be there another year. But luckily, I was able to complete most of the things that needed to happen during the year. So I was working at the Natural Resources Institute of Finland, and that's a government research center. I'm a visual artist, but I was collaborating with restoration ecologists there. And we were looking at former peatlands, so a place where Finland harvests a lot of the biofuel that it uses for heating and electricity. And so I had been able to do a bunch of site work, field visits. I sourced a bunch of materials from site to make some handmade paper and inks and dyes, and different kinds of paint made with peat ash, things like that. So luckily, all of that was getting ready for an exhibit that was supposed to open in April. So it was mostly ready by the time I left. And then the exhibit is rescheduled for July. So the show will go on a little differently than before.
Well, I'm so sorry you're not going to be there for the show. That's disappointing, but your work is so fascinating. And when we were looking at your submissions, it was just, we at the Center for Creativity, we love looking at things from a variety of perspectives, and we love multidisciplinary projects. And so to see an artist that's collaborating with scientists and looking at ecology and sustainability, it was just really interesting to us. And your piece that was accepted, tell us more a little bit about how you created it and the ideas behind it.
Yeah. So that piece, I was thinking specifically about the physiology of the sphagnum plant. And that's the moss that grows in these peatland ecosystems, which really only develop in a few parts of the world. They're pretty remote, at least in Finland. And the plant develops and decomposes, mostly at or below ground level. So I'm really intrigued by, this is something that is not really possible for a lot of people to see. So thinking about how can I share about this plant? And then I think it's especially interesting given that we're spending so much of our time at home, to think about this plant, which really started to seem to me as something that engineers its own home. So the sphagnum moss has hyaline cells, which are these like kind of spongy, empty spaces that collect water, and it can actually hold 20 times its weight in water. And so it's this really strange thing that, like, as it dies, the dead tissue is what shapes the ecosystem as we know it, and ends up making it into this fuel that has led to the harvest and draining of so many of these peatlands. But I wanted to kind of illustrate that strange sponginess, and the way, like, we think of a conserved peatland as natural, but actually it's a really inhospitable environment for a lot of other things. So the peat plant makes essentially a really acidic, wet desert that's completely waterlogged and anaerobic, and the regular breakdown of nutrients can't happen. If other plants start trying to grow on the peat mat, they can eventually weigh themselves down and drown themselves. And I'm really intrigued by, like, the mechanisms this particular plant develops, since it's kind of stuck in this really harsh and cold place, to make to make its home, and then thinking about how we're so similar as humans, constructing an environment where we thrive that's not necessarily hospitable to other things. And that question,
Right.
what's natural, what's unnatural, being a more complicated one than it seems initially.
Oh, without a doubt. And how did you get interested in peat? This is not something that really rises to the forefront of many people's minds, but definitely not artists.
And it wasn't really something that I thought much about until about 2 years ago. So when I was planning this Fulbright project. But I think it all started from an interest that I've had in restoration, ecology, and ethics starting in Montana. And so we have a really important extraction industry and legacy to deal with in Montana from mostly mining. And so thinking about issues in restoration of, like, we may need to take action urgently, to prevent a permanent loss of an ecosystem, but we don't necessarily know the long-term impact of that kind of action. And then also this tension between, and I think of this for myself as an artist especially, like, should I be making work that intervenes in these ecosystems I'm talking about? Or, what are the limits of my expertise as an artist to do that? So I think it's really fertile ground to explore. And so when I was reaching out to folks to potentially do research with in Finland, I came across this team of researchers, Anne, Oili, and Annalisa at Luke, which is the nickname of the Natural Resources Institute. And they, as a team, they've worked together for, about a decade on a whole bunch of different projects and different ecosystems, but this was one that they wanted to focus on. And so I think in some ways I kind of fell into it. But I was telling you before we were officially starting the interview, one of the things that they're investigating with these peatland sites, so the peat has been harvested about 5 years ago, and they've been studying ways that they can rehabilitate this land that's essentially a desert at this point, into reindeer habitat. And so they've been working with reindeer herders in northern Finland. And when we went to the site, I could see reindeer just kind of strolling through and grazing.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. So what's next for you artistically, and what are you working on now, and how do you see your work adapting to our post-pandemic world?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think that my studio practice is kind of always evolving, and some of that is on purpose. Like I enjoy placing myself in a lab essentially in Finland and thinking, like, okay, how can I work here? And working with people from a different background and expertise. And I think that each project I kind of try to give myself an assignment or a challenge to learn some new technique or process. So in some ways, I think a change would be expected, and like hopefully I can welcome it. And then while I was in Finland, I had a chance to spend a week in Kilpisjärvi in the Arctic. And so Finland is described as, some people think of it, the shape of it, as a dancing woman. And so she has one arm kind of out facing towards Norway. And so at the tip of that arm is Kilpisjärvi. Okay. And so I had a chance to work with some other artists and researchers in Finland's BioArt Society up there in September. And our working group was called High Altitude Bioprospecting. And we're using a helicopter to try to detect microbes at high altitude. So it's a helium-filled balloon. And we had some copper windsocks and collected some microbes and sent them to the lab for processing. And now we're getting that data back and thinking about how do we share that. So we have a couple shows coming up in about a full calendar year, hopefully. And hopefully one in Helsinki and one in the UK. And so I think I hope that will be kind of an interesting next step to explore. And I think it's especially important to think about the travel of microbes and how interconnected everything is. I thought about that with the peatland research too. Peatlands also kind of respirate. And I was able to meet another Fulbright researcher who's doing larger scale measurements of gas exchange in peatlands. And so we think of them as being really remote. And that's something that I find intriguing about some of this research is like, it is really remote and it's something that I can share that some people maybe haven't seen. And then thinking about how, our ability to move so much more quickly and further and our impact on these ecosystems is, we have maybe more capacity to have a big impact than ever before. And so things like this pandemic can really make us hopefully reevaluate, what is that impact that we're having and how are our actions directly tied to these places that they might seem separate.
Without a doubt. And thank you for asking those questions through your art. This is just so relevant to our time. And you can see Anne's work as well as the work by the other artists at centerforcreativitytulsa.com on our Facebook page at Center for Creativity Tulsa. And thank you so much. Do you have a website or a social media tag that you want to share?
Sure. Most of my work is on my website. It's AnneYoncha.com. And on Instagram, you can see some process photos and cool things that I saw in Finland. When it's also Anne Yoncha.
And that's Yoncha, Yoncha. Thank you so much, Anne. Good luck, and we hope you make it back to Finland sooner rather than later.
Thanks for having me. Great to
meet you.